1961, Studio A at Motown Records, Detroit. The session had been going for 6 hours straight. Sweat dripped from Marvin Gaye's forehead as he kept the rhythm for the Supremes, his hands moving in perfect time while Diana Ross commanded the microphone just 15 feet away. But Marvin wasn't watching Diana. He was staring at the empty space behind the mic stand, imagining himself there, imagining his voice filling the room instead of just his drums. That night, when everyone else went home, Marvin stayed behind. He sat at the drum kit in the empty studio, and for the first time, he whispered the words that would haunt him for the next decade. "I can sing better than half these people, but nobody's listening." What Marvin didn't know that night was that this feeling would consume him. The invisible man behind the drums, watching careers launch while his own voice remained unheard. And when his moment finally came, that decade of invisibility would leave scars that success could never heal. Before we explore this untold chapter of music history, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the stories behind the legends who changed music forever. To understand why Marvin Gaye spent so many years hidden behind a drum kit, you need to understand what Motown was in 1960. It wasn't just a record label, it was a machine. A carefully constructed hit factory where everyone had their place, their role, their function. And Marvin's function was rhythm, nothing more. Berry Gordy had built Motown on the assembly line principle he'd learned working at the Ford Motor Company. Songwriters wrote, producers produced, singers sang, and musicians played their instruments. The system worked because nobody questioned it, nobody stepped out of line. Marvin Gaye arrived at Motown in late 1960, a 21-year-old from Washington, D.C., with a voice he'd trained in church choirs and a desperation born from having no other options. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., had made it clear that music was a sin unless it served God. But young Marvin had heard Sam Cooke, had felt the pull of secular music, and had chosen his path. When Harvey Fuqua recommended Marvin to Berry Gordy, it wasn't as a singer, it was as a session musician. Marvin could play piano, but Motown already had plenty of piano players. What they needed was a drummer who could keep time for the endless parade of young hopefuls who streamed through the studio doors. So Marvin became a drummer, not by choice, not by passion, but by necessity. The early sessions were a revelation and a torture. Marvin found himself in the same room as some of the most talented young artists in America. He watched Mary Wells record My Guy, kept rhythm while Stevie Wonder, just 12 years old, laid down tracks that would make him a star. He was there when the Marvelettes recorded Please Mr. Postman, his drums providing the foundation for what would become Motown's first #1 hit. But he was always behind the drums, always in the background, always invisible. The psychological weight of this invisibility grew heavier with each passing month. Marvin began to develop small rituals, desperate attempts to assert his presence. He would arrive at the studio wearing his best shirt, even though no one would see it behind the drum kit. He would position himself where he could catch Berry Gordy's eye in the reflection of the control room glass, hoping for some sign of recognition that never came. During lunch breaks, while other musicians socialized, Marvin would sit alone in the studio, running his fingers over piano keys, humming melodies that existed only in his head. These weren't just songs, they were conversations with himself, a way of processing the daily humiliation of being treated as equipment rather than an artist. The other session musicians noticed his isolation but misinterpreted it. They saw him as aloof, maybe a little arrogant. What they didn't see was a young man slowly disappearing into himself, building walls that would take years to tear down. James Jamerson, the bass player, once invited Marvin to grab drinks after a session. Marvin declined, mumbling something about being tired. The truth was more complicated. He was afraid that spending time with the musicians as an equal would somehow diminish his secret dreams of being something more. There were nights when Marvin would drive home from the studio and sit in his car outside his apartment, unable to face going inside. In those moments, the weight of his father's disapproval, his own unfulfilled ambitions, and the daily grind of being invisible would converge into something close to despair. He would think about the church where he'd first learned to sing, about the congregation that had celebrated his voice, and wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake leaving that world behind. The isolation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Marvin found it increasingly difficult to maintain relationships outside the studio. How could he explain to friends what he did for a living? "I play drums for famous singers," sounded impressive, but it felt like a lie. How could he tell his mother about his days without admitting that her son, who she'd raised to believe in his own potential, was slowly losing faith in everything he'd once been certain about? The other musicians got to know him as reliable, professional, someone who never missed a beat. But they didn't know about the notebooks he kept, filled with song lyrics he wrote during breaks. They didn't know about the melodies that played in his head while he kept time for other people's dreams. What they also didn't know was how Marvin had developed a strange relationship with silence. In those moments between song, when the studio fell quiet and everyone reset for the next take, Marvin would feel a peculiar kind of panic. The silence meant he didn't exist. No drums, no rhythm, no purpose. He began to dread those pauses, filling them by quietly humming under his breath or tapping his sticks against his leg, anything to maintain some proof that he was still there. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days creating the foundation for other people's voices while his own remained unheard. Sometimes late at night in his apartment, he would sit at his small, upright piano and sing the same songs he'd spent the day drumming for, imagining how they might sound with his interpretation, his phrasing, his soul. In those early days, Marvin would arrive at the studio an hour before sessions started, not because he needed to warm up, but because he wanted to sit at the piano and work on his own songs. He'd play quietly, barely above a whisper, terrified that someone would walk in and tell him to stick to the drums. The hardest part wasn't the physical work. Drumming for 8, 10, 12 hours a day was exhausting, but Marvin was young and strong. The hardest part was watching as singers younger than him got their breaks, watching as Berry Gordy's attention fixed on new faces while Marvin remained part of the furniture. There was a session in early 1962 that nearly broke him. The Miracles were recording "You've Really Got a Hold on Me," and Smokey Robinson was having trouble with the vocal. Take after take, Smokey would stop, frustrated with his performance. During a break, Marvin quietly hummed the melody, adding his own interpretation, a smoother, more soulful approach. One of the other session musicians heard him and said, "Man, you should be singing this." But when Berry Gordy walked back into the control room, the conversation stopped. The session resumed, and Marvin went back to keeping time. That night, Marvin called his mother from a payphone outside the studio. He told her he was thinking about coming home, maybe finding work in a factory, something steady. His mother listened patiently, then said something that would stay with him. "Son, God doesn't give you a gift so you can hide it, but he also doesn't promise it'll be easy to share." The next morning, Marvin was back behind the drums. What kept him going during those endless sessions wasn't hope. It was stubbornness, a refusal to admit that maybe he wasn't good enough, maybe he was fooling himself, maybe drums were all he'd ever be. Every day he stayed was another day of proving to himself that he belonged somewhere else. The other artists at Motown began to notice Marvin's voice during sessions, not as a lead vocalist, but in the background vocals he provided. He had a natural instinct for harmony, could find the perfect complement to any lead vocal. Gradually, his voice started appearing on more records, buried in the mix but present. But background vocals weren't enough. They were just another form of invisibility. The turning point came in late 1962, but not in the way Marvin had imagined. He wasn't discovered because of his voice or his songwriting. He was noticed because he made a mistake. During a session with the Supremes, Marvin was supposed to keep a simple, steady beat, but something about the song, about Diana Ross's delivery, inspired him to add a subtle flourish, a small but noticeable deviation from what had been arranged. The producer stopped the session, irritated. "Drummer, stick to what's written," he said, not even using Marvin's name. But Berry Gordy, who had been listening from the control room, walked into the studio. "Actually," he said, "do that again, but bigger this time." Marvin repeated the flourish, and Berry nodded approvingly. It was the first time in 2 years that Berry Gordy had spoken directly to him about music, about creativity rather than just competence. After the session, Berry asked Marvin to stay behind. They sat in the empty studio, and Berry asked the question Marvin had been waiting to hear. "You write songs?" Marvin nodded, afraid to speak, afraid this moment would disappear if he said the wrong thing. "Bring me something tomorrow," Barry said. That night, Marvin didn't sleep. He went through every song he'd written, every melody he'd hummed, trying to find the one that would change his life. He settled on a song called "Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide," a gospel-influenced number that showcased his vocal range without being too ambitious. But as the hours passed, doubt crept in. What if Barry had been humoring him? What if tomorrow he would laugh and say it was all a joke? Marvin found himself at his kitchen table at 3 in the morning, rewriting lyrics he'd already perfected, second-guessing every note, every word. The song that had felt like salvation a few hours earlier now felt like potential humiliation. He thought about calling in sick, telling Barry he needed more time. But something his mother had said during that phone call months earlier echoed in his mind. God doesn't give you a gift so you can hide it. Maybe this was the moment when hiding was no longer an option. When dawn broke, Marvin was still awake, still at the kitchen table, surrounded by crumpled pages of rewrites. His hands were shaking, not from caffeine, but from the weight of knowing that in a few hours, everything would change one way or another. The next day, Marvin performed the song for Berry Gordy in the same studio where he'd spent 2 years as Invisible Furniture. His voice filled the space, rich and nuanced, carrying emotions that drums could never express. When he finished, Barry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We'll record this next week." But even as success beckoned, the years of invisibility had left their mark. When Marvin stepped into the vocal booth for his first official recording session as an artist, his hands were shaking. Not from excitement, but from a deep-seated fear that someone would realize this was a mistake, that he belonged behind the drums, not behind the microphone. The session musicians who had worked with him for years watched from the other side of the glass as Marvin Gaye transformed from their reliable drummer into something else entirely. His voice on "Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide" was confident, sophisticated, adult in a way that the teenage stars dominating Motown at the time couldn't match. But the transformation wasn't as smooth as it appeared. Between takes, Marvin would catch himself tapping rhythms on his leg, muscle memory from years behind the kit. When the producer asked him to try a different phrasing, his first instinct was to look toward where the drums would be, checking the beat that was no longer his responsibility. The other musicians in the session noticed these small gestures. Earl Van Dyke, the piano player, later said it was like watching someone learn to walk again. Marvin kept looking around like he was lost, Van Dyke remembered. He knew how to sing, but he didn't know how to be the singer yet. The most telling moment came during a break in recording. Marvin walked over to his old drum kit, still set up in the corner of the studio. He picked up the sticks and played a quiet rhythm, just for a few seconds. Then he set them down and walked back to the microphone. It was a goodbye that no one else understood, but Marvin felt it in his bones. He was crossing a line he could never uncross. But Marvin himself couldn't shake the feeling that he was pretending, that at any moment someone would tell him to go back to the drums. The single was released in May 1962, and while it wasn't a massive hit, it established Marvin Gaye as a legitimate Motown artist. More sessions followed, more singles, and gradually the drums became part of his past. But the psychology of those invisible years never left him. Even as his career soared, even as he became one of Motown's biggest stars, Marvin carried with him the fear of being overlooked, of being reduced to background, of being told he didn't belong in the spotlight. In interviews years later, when he was asked about his early days at Motown, Marvin would often mention the drumming, but always with a distant tone, as if he were talking about someone else's life. "I was learning," he would say, "watching, waiting." What he rarely mentioned was how those years of invisibility shaped his approach to fame. Even at the height of his success, Marvin preferred the studio to the stage, the controlled environment where he could perfect his art, rather than the unpredictable energy of live performance. The man who had spent years watching others perform had never fully convinced himself that people wanted to watch him. The drums had given him rhythm, but they had also given him something else. The perspective of the outsider, the observer, the one who sees everything but isn't seen. That perspective would inform his greatest songs, his most introspective lyrics, his ability to capture feelings that other artists couldn't articulate. but it also gave him a loneliness that success could never cure. No matter how many records he sold, how many awards he won, how loud the applause got, part of Marvin Gaye remained behind that drum kit, invisible, waiting for someone to notice he was there. In his final interview, recorded just months before his death in 1984, Marvin was asked what he remembered most about his early days at Motown. He was quiet for a long time, then said, "I remember thinking that if I could just get someone to listen, really listen, everything would be different. And then people listened, and I realized that being heard isn't the same as being understood." He paused, his fingers unconsciously tapping a rhythm on the table. "Sometimes I still hear those drums in my head," he added quietly, keeping time for a song that never ends. The drums were long gone, but the rhythm they had taught him remained, the steady beat of someone who had learned to wait, to watch, to hope that someday someone would notice he was there. Today, when people think of Marvin Gaye, they think of the voice, the hits, the legend. They don't think about the young man behind the drum kit, sweating through session after session, dreaming of the moment when he could step into the light. But that young man was always there, even at the height of fame, still keeping time, still waiting, still wondering if anyone was really listening. The drums had made him invisible, but they had also made him Marvin Gaye.